I'm part of a group called the National Committee for Soil and Terrain, and a number of years back we asked all the states around Australia to submit their best whitest beach. And very controversial. There is actually a website called whitestbeach.com. I'm sure you've probably come across it. And now Western Australians, you should be proud because we have, in fact, the whitest beach in Australia, which is over at Hellfire Bay, La Grande. But we also, Albany has the 4th whitest beach in Australia, which is down at Little Beach. So really where I'm going now is the evolution of sand that goes into soil. And probably the conversation that we're having here is probably more of a policy type sort of area. I've been in the South Coast region for a long time, and I have the responsibility of compiling this particular document. The thing I probably need to mention is that, so the strategy is a first for Western Australia. Western Australia's never had a soil or state soil health strategy. There have been many plans in the regional plans and regional investment plans and the like from NRM bodies, but actually this is the first strategy for Western Australia. It's also the first strategy for Australia. No other state around Australia has actually gone to the effort of putting together a document such as this. It's also awkward because Western Australia is a very diverse landscape. It covers the wheat belt, it covers the rangelands, it has diverse soils, so it's actually quite a challenge to put this particular document together. The other thing that we wanted to do was try and target the positive aspects of soil. And I'm sure you've probably seen, look, I'm sorry, I'm going to have some examples up there anyway, about erosion scars in the landscape and how, you know, these great plumes of dust blowing across the landscape. And I think every farmer's got a social conscience and they don't like seeing their paddocks and their pastures eroding in the landscape. And so what we wanted to try and do in actually putting this document together was look at a dynamic or a more positive aspect of it. So to a little bit of history. Back in 2013, we put together these condition report cards, and they were based on the best available information or data at the time. And it actually came on the legacy of probably 30 years of soil information collection over that period of time. We also put together a pastorals rangelands report card based on a fairly sort of similar principle, and it's a real bucket of mess in the pastoral rangelands area because you've mostly got pastoral lease landscapes, and we've got some pastoral rangelands area in our sort of, you know, south coast southern region area as you go out towards Balladonia and some of those landscapes out there. So you don't necessarily have to think that it's always up in the Kimberleys and up in the arid area up north. So it's a challenging area, and there's a new framework that's being put together for that as well. So that's 2017, 2013. In the scale of things, that's actually not too far back. In the process of putting this stuff together, at the time, we came up with this very dynamic, and it was considered quite innovative at the time, this approach to trying to determine trend. We had a little bit of a triangle, and we looked at land management, we looked at climate, and we looked at the actual land use to try and get a bit of an idea as to whether something was increasing, decreasing, whether it was a big risk or a low risk. So this one was done back in 2013, and I guess one of the sad things about it is that as you look through some of these things, either the regions, I'm sorry, well, you have the southern wheat belt, I don't have the south coast because I kind of ran out of space down the side here, but essentially when you look at some of these here, very high risk in the West Midlands area, 2013, 7 years ago, if you were to go back there now, unfortunately you're probably not seeing a great deal of change. And that's the benefit of being able to monitor stuff, is you actually want to be able to see change. You want to try and put things into practice so you can see things improve. Now, the way that we value soil, a couple of ways of valuing soil. One is actually to look at the gross value of agricultural production, where you're looking at GVAP, and the produce that's made from soil. So last year, soil, you could say, was valued at around about $10.7 billion. And the other way of valuing soil is actually looking at natural capital accounting, which is now taking a little bit of an uptake as well, where you're actually looking at a whole range of things, of those sort of social, societal benefits to the value of soil. So in this case here, now we're looking at the cost of degradation in the landscape. And when we talk about these numbers like 1.5 billion and the like, they're actually based on the cost or loss of production. So what you're losing from production in that soil, from soil acidity, the loss of the yield and the cost of that loss of the yield. So when you look at, and I probably need to context this a little bit, it's not cumulative. We can't add this column up all down the bottom here because there are a number of these things like wind erosion and water repellents, probably concurrent with soil acidity and the like. But as you run down the list, I've just told you don't take it concurrently, but if you do and you run it all together, the cost is around about $4 billion. So, you know, it's quite shocking to learn that really degradation in our landscape is probably around about 20% of the gross value of agricultural production from soil. These are a number of the indicators that are used on the side here and a number of the sources of data that are collected. Now, I'm probably going to clip over to this one and then go back. The significance I want to point to, it doesn't really matter whether you're a disciple or a skeptic or an advocate or otherwise of climate change. We have an issue in Australia and we have a drying climate in Western Australia. This is a map that was put together. The Department of Primary Industries is responsible for putting an annual report through the Soil and Land Conservation Commissioner that goes out to Treasury and Department and various others. And what we're saying here is that from July 1st, 2017 to June 20, is that we had about a 36-month rainfall deficit across the southwest coast of Western Australia. That's very significant. Okay, I put this presentation together before it started raining last week. But I would still say that the rainfall that fell was still pretty much just hugging along the coastline. It actually didn't go very much far inland. And so if I go back to the other slide I had here, which is really emphasising this point that Western Australia's got a drying climate, and the things that we're observing is that traditional autumn season break is becoming less well defined. We're actually getting a greater risk of prefrontal winds coming through that aren't rain-bearing fronts, and so there are very strong winds that are coming through. We're getting a much greater propensity of summer storms coming through areas like Ravensthorpe and Newdigate and those areas at critical times when the soil is essentially bare, when it's got very little ground cover. And so this is why we're experiencing so much degradation as we see in the landscape. But part of the other issue is this issue of there's a lot of increase of these management decisions that farmers are putting into practice. Nothing wrong with the management choice that they're using, but it's how it's being applied after that. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So as an example here, this is Geraldton. So this was May of this year. Now one of them's sand and the other one's smoke. So I don't want you to confuse the two. But this is a corporate farm in this part of the landscape where they used this approach. They called it soil inversion. It's a very fascinating exercise. We actually turn the soil upside down to deal with weeds. John Moore there, you know a little bit about soil, mole ball ploughing, I think sometimes people call it. And in the process of doing that, it kind of like creates a desert on the topsoil. So there's nothing wrong with the practice, but it's when the practice is done. And we would say as an organisation, it has to be done when the soil is moist, and that needs to be seeded fairly soon straight after. But a lot of the issue is that people are running short of time and they do it at the wrong time of the year and when the soil is exposed and dry, and then you've got this desert and then all the organic matter is now buried below in the profile, and so you get a bit of a wind up, and then of course this is what happens. You see the smoke in the distance there, so you get all this landscape rolling across. So that's wind erosion. The other risk issue here is once upon a time back in the 30s, we had farmers who would plough across the slope, they'd plough up and down the slope. And we said, well, that was bad, you shouldn't do that, you should actually plough across the slope. And they did that. Then we came up with this new thing called controlled traffic farming, and then farmers now have gone back to ploughing up and down the slope, but using minimum tillage. But anywhere where there's a small track and water congregates and you get velocity of water, it starts to scour out the landscape and you get these erosion. And so there are a number of things that we still, even as an advanced society, don't know, like what is the threshold, slope threshold? Is it 3%? Is it 5%? Are there areas where you shouldn't actually be farming in this particular manner across the landscape? Western Australia has this legislation, the key legislation supporting soil condition and monitoring in Western Australia. It's called the Soil and Land Conservation Act. It was written back in 1945. It's very much due for an update. Behind you, it's also a very strong piece of legislation And so that is in the process of being looked at now. So as key legislation, that's really what drives us as a state. Every state has got some form of Land Conservation Act. Western Australia, I'd probably say, is probably the strongest next to New South Wales. So I just want to take a little bit of time just talking about this particular one here. This is some of the risks that we're facing, is that we've got challenges with fewer people sampling spatially. We've got a greater number of people that are retiring from the landscape. We don't have as many students coming through. We've got issues with best practice management that's being ignored, and there's the whole issue of bushfires and the like as well. So a strategic need was identified. It was determined that Western Australia has a desperate need to be able to address this from a strategic point of view, and it was the idea of moving away from the negative and focusing on some of the more positive elements as well. So then we have decided to put together a state soil health strategy. I'm sorry, the vision is very motherhoodish, which is, Western Australia will receive the benefit of healthy and diverse soil ecosystems now and into the future, etc., etc. A few things that I'll gloss over fairly quickly because I'm running a little short of time, but it's a high-level strategy. We have these three major themes that are in the process: soil governance, research application, and soil carbon sequestration. We've produced a discussion paper, and with the discussion paper, we've already gone through one process of consultation, but we're currently now writing it, and there'll be another process of consultation. So my encouragement is to you is that when you see this coming out, is please make the effort to make some comment on it. An ecosystem is essentially the good stuff that's provided to support us at the other end. Some examples of some ecosystem services. We have supporting, regulating, provisioning cultural habitat. They're the ecosystem service. And so some of the things that come out of that are soil formation, organic carbon, stable habitat for the microbiome. There's a very complex diagram. I don't want anybody to try and look at that at all, but I was just trying to explain there the density of information that's there. So some of the things and not very much more to go, some of the things that are really important to take in when you're talking about ecosystem services and their relationship to soil health, things like an undisturbed soil provides a habitat for ground-dwelling bees and other insects and the like. Resisting erosion, so if you have a soil that has structural stability and strength that help to grow. So that's what you want to try and focus on, is actually addressing the issues of the ecosystem service, both disservice and the service that supports. And then, that's it. Just in the nick of time.